Hello, everyone. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to today's webinar. My name is Molly Banuelos. I serve on the board of directors of the High Speed Rail Alliance. Thank you all so much for joining us today. For those of you who might be turning in for the first time, the Alliance aims to be the best source of information about what high-speed rail is, as well as its benefits. We also work to support elected officials and other local leaders working to achieve these goals. The Alliance is a nonprofit organization, and individual members and donors like you provide most of our support. We do have paid staff, but many of us, including our board of directors, serve as volunteers. We do this because we want to see much better train service across North America. Specifically, I work at the Quebec Delegation Government Office in Chicago, and we've been proud members and supporting members of the Alliance for several years now. We certainly see the value in collaboration across North America around train travel and mass transit. So we'd love to introduce you to more of our board members and other volunteers in future talks, so please don't hesitate to reach out. For now, though, I'd like to turn this over to our Executive Director, Rick Harnish, who will set the stage for today's discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you to the Quebec delegation for many years of support. It's been incredibly valuable, and I look forward to the day that I can take a high-speed train from Chicago to Montreal with the quick stops in Detroit and Toronto. So, as Molly mentioned, we are a nonprofit. We are supported by members like you, and essentially it's a group of folks working to make this happen across the country. Other countries have done it. We can do it as well. One of the top destinations in the Midwest is a place called O'Hare Airport. It's a huge traffic generator and a very essential component of connecting much of the world together. In 2022, it was the most connected airport in the world, which means in terms of you can connect from one flight to another flight to connect to the most cities. But it's not very well connected to its primary market, the area that's 200 miles to 300 or so miles within a circle of that. And we've long advocated for getting high-speed trains into the field so that people can use it to get to those big planes more often, which means we can have more big planes there. And as a resident of Chicago, I want to make sure, because I'm backstopping the bonds for the big expansions, I want to make sure that airport is as successful as possible. So we have a committee of volunteers who meets occasionally on Saturdays to talk about issues of how we deal with the very complex issues of getting high-speed rail into and through Chicago, with O'Hare as a big destination of that work. And they decided as a group to fund an initial study of comparing O'Hare to several different airports that look similar, and see if we can draw any lessons between them. So I'm really excited for that what we call the technical committee, and their work and their leadership in getting this study done. And I'm also very excited about the speakers who did the work, who are speaking today. So we've got Andrew Goetz, who's a professor of geography and environment at the University of Denver. And today he's in Cambridge, England. Anthony Pearl is a professor of urban studies and political science at the Simon Fraser University of British Columbia. And he's joining us today from Vancouver, British Columbia. And Eric Brun is a consultant in these matters and an author of the book Sustainable Infrastructure Investment Towards a More Equitable Future. So I'm really excited about the work they've done. We'll give you a little tease of that study today. And hopefully we'll learn something and move forward. And as normal, if you have questions, please put them in the question field. And if you just want to chat with your other folks, you can do that through the chat button. But Andy, I will give it to you to kick off. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Rick. And thanks to HSRA for providing us an opportunity to be able to share with you the results of our report on this subject. So I'm just going to share our screen here. And I hope everyone can see that all right. So this study was one that HSRA did commission. And for the study, we were really interested to learn from what has been done previously, the literature as well as the experiences of other places. Of course, the application here and the impetus for the study was with regards to Chicago and O'Hare Airport. And this is in recognition of what could eventually be a growing rail network that will be serving the Chicago area and also potentially O'Hare Airport. And so Rick had mentioned that there is this radius around Chicago of perhaps up to 200 miles, maybe even up to, say, 350 miles, around which or within which people might be able to access O'Hare by rail, thus maybe relieving some of the need for shorter distance flights from many of these places to O'Hare. And so people might be able to access O'Hare by the rail mode. And so this is somewhat of an exciting prospect. And so as a result, what we really wanted to do in terms of our focus was to look at the effects that we know already about high-speed rail linkages to airports. And specifically what we're most interested in are those airports where there are high-speed links that go directly to the airport, so that there is a station, a high-speed station, right there at the airport, what we would refer to as a direct access to the airport. So we based this upon previous findings. We scoured the literature that has been done on the topic of linkages of high-speed rail to airports. And from that literature and also our discussions, we decided to focus in on 3 cases, all of which are in Europe. Frankfurt, Germany, Paris, Charles de Gaulle in France, and Copenhagen Airport in Denmark. And so we will be talking a little bit about each of these cases here in a little while. And then we'll conclude our discussion with a summary of results and the main implications that come from what we have learned thus far. So with that, I think I will turn it over to my colleague, Anthony, who will take us through some of the previous findings from the literature.
Thanks, Andy. One of the advantages to being a laggard in high-speed rail, one of the few advantages perhaps, is that there's a lot of experience and evidence now over the last 50 years in what the effects and what the lessons can be drawn from building this type of infrastructure, including connecting it up to airports. China has been a more recent developer of high-speed rail, but it's moved so fast and so widely that it's not surprising that there's a huge amount of research that is coming out of China on the effects of their high-speed rail system, particularly on their aviation system. And one of the main findings that we've found in the literature documented is that basically for their domestic national transportation mode shares, the growth of the high-speed rail network has capped or impacted the growth of their domestic aviation network, and that is now declining. So the number of air passengers traveling in China in places where the high-speed rail network operates, which covers about 80% of the population in China, domestic air travel passenger numbers have gone down. And China has not seen a proportional growth in its domestic air travel network that you would normally or otherwise project from the economic activity and other growth dynamics in their society. In other words, high-speed rail has basically in China filled the mobility needs for domestic intercity transportation that in Europe and in North America 30, 40, 50 years previously were filled by airlines growing that intercity travel. And this is not just the case on short 200, 300 mile an hour routes, but all the way up to close to 1,000 miles where there is established high-speed rail links. Shanghai to Beijing, or Beijing to Hong Kong. We're talking about the distances that are comparable to Chicago to Philadelphia, to the East Coast. Even there, there's been evidence that the high-speed rail has taken most of the share of growth of travel, and domestic aviation has not grown. But we also found evidence that long-distance air travel has grown in China, and some of that seems to be stimulated by the linkages with the high-speed rail system that can feed those flights, as well as removing short-distance aircraft movements and leaving capacity for the longer haul. Next slide, please. When we move to Europe, we've seen, I guess, the similar but smaller scale effects of the impacts of high-speed rail. Some routes, such as the Eurostar route between the UK and Paris or Brussels, have had very large impacts on reducing air travel, shifting it to rail, or in Spain on their original high-speed line from Madrid to Seville. Another study by Clulo and colleagues showed that high-speed rail that got into an airport with direct access, where you see that happening, you also saw the decline of between 12 and 49% on air travel within that country from that airport. So definite substitutions with high-speed rail and national air travel in a country. That was also confirmed at two of our case studies, which we'll talk about later, in Frankfurt and Paris. Interesting finding from Al-Balate, Bell, and Fageda shows that air travel declined more in places where high-speed rail served the city, but not the airport. In other words, and this is something that we think US airlines should pay attention to in their position on developing this intermodal access, where there is on-site direct high-speed rail intermodal access to aviation, there can be a synergy between the modes. But if cities don't connect up their high-speed rail to their airports, then the loser tends to be air travel, where people just use the train directly to the city instead of flying. We also saw that mode share rises not just by travelers, but also by people working at the airport, especially within the regional rail shed, which could be relevant to Chicago. It opens up the labor force and labor market and allows people to live not as close to the airport and still work there and get there by train. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, and I think Andy did too, we came up with a 3-tier definition of what high-speed rail access to an airport can look like. There's direct access, the stations like Frankfurt or Paris or Copenhagen, where there is an on-site high-speed rail connection that you can walk to essentially from the air terminal. Then there are an intermediate type of infrastructure where trains do serve an airport. Let's say like Zurich in Switzerland, but these are not high-speed trains. They're intercity trains that connect you to a central rail terminal, usually in the city center, where the high-speed rail options are available in a short connection. And finally, there's indirect access. We have plenty of examples, including currently the way Chicago would be configured, where you could take a local metro, the Blue Line, I believe, for a while to connect at a train station elsewhere in the region. Each of those have some synergies and interactions, but obviously the direct access is the biggest impact. Next slide, please. As a general overview, the time in which we were studying this, when secondary research has been made on all these connections, at least in Europe, showed a growth of all modes. The air modes seem to be growing the steepest. That's the entire 27-nation European Union, and our hypothesis is that most of that growth was happening in trips and travel markets which were not served by high-speed rail, because only a subset of the EU network of high-speed trains is in place, as you'll see in a minute. You can also see that there was a flatlining and even a slight decline of conventional rail service and a move over to growing high-speed trains. So there's been an intramodal shift in Europe where people have moved from conventional trains to high-speed trains once they've come into service. Next slide, please. So here you see the European high-speed rail network with two big sort of hub and spoke systems in Spain, centered on Madrid, and France, centered on Paris, and then other lines serving major markets in Italy, Germany, and other Sweden and Finland too, and a time frame to connect up everything into a trans-European high-speed rail network that extends still into the next decade or two going forward. Next slide. Here you see the airports in Europe that are directly connected in the first two tiers of the definition that we had on high-speed rail. There's 11 with direct access, 11 European airports where you can walk directly from the airport terminal and can get onto a high-speed train. And there's 23 more where you can get onto a conventional train, which will take you to a high-speed transfer point within a short, less than an hour's trip time. Next slide. I think that's where we're now going to switch over to discussing the case studies, and I'll give it back to Andy to begin with Frankfurt.
Okay, very good. Yeah, thank you, Anthony. So as I'd mentioned earlier, we had decided to focus on these three case study cities: Paris, Charles de Gaulle, or I should say airports: Paris, Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, and Copenhagen. And the reasons why we chose these airports, first of all, is that they do have that direct access by high-speed rail. That was a critical element that we were looking for. But also, we wanted to choose airports that were relatively large, that served as hubs for major airlines, and where there were very good rail connections from and to those airports. One of the things we did was to collect some data on each of these airports to show some of their relevance to passenger transportation. And it was interesting to see the percentages of air passengers that are using these rail stations, which are relatively high, and especially in the case of Copenhagen, at 60% is really quite astounding. So what I'd like to do first is to talk about the case of Frankfurt. And then I'll turn it over to Eric, who will talk about Paris, Charles de Gaulle, and Copenhagen. So the German high-speed rail system was developed over a period of time, mostly starting in the 1990s, and then continuing on after that as well, and done in a fashion where certain segments were built and connecting certain city pairs. And so it is not a hub and spoke network like we see in either France or in Spain, but instead is a more of a diverse network with interconnections between different city pairs. Also, another feature of the German system is that it is characterized by a hybrid network where there is a mix of both high speed as well as conventional train service. So certain segments are going to run at high speed, other segments are going to be run at more conventional speeds. But as the high-speed segments were added to the system, then we began to see that travel times between Frankfurt Airport, where an actual dedicated high-speed station was built starting in 1999, once that happened and these high-speed lines were being built, that travel times to a number of destinations really reduced significantly over the ensuing years. And so what that resulted in was a situation in which the catchment area for people going, whoops, sorry, I'll just stick on that one, for people coming from different areas around Germany and even outside of Germany, that catchment area grew. And one of the goals of the efforts to try to integrate high-speed rail with the airline networks, particularly those of Lufthansa Airlines, was to increase the catchment area to a range of 200 kilometers and to tap into the population centers that were within a 200-kilometer radius of Frankfurt Airport. And for the most part, that's been a successful endeavor. This is just a little exercise that we conducted as a part of this study. Most of the study is based upon previous work, previous literature that others have done that we've taken and just reported on. But this was one exercise that we conducted just to see what's been happening in terms of the changes in the flights from these case study airports based upon distance. And so what we found is that typically we see a decline in the number of short-haul flights coming from these airports once the high-speed rail lines start to open up. In the case of Frankfurt, this is most apparent for those that were under 200 kilometers, but there were declines even for those in the 200 to 300 kilometer range and 300 to 400. Once it got beyond 400 kilometers, and then especially over that, then they increased, and the overall total increased. So this suggests, and it kind of corroborates what was found in some of the literature about the role of these airports and the role of high-speed rail as acting as feeders to the hub for longer distance flights. So a substitution of short distance flights with high-speed rail leading to more of the longer distance flights. One place where this clearly showed up was in the case of the Frankfurt-Cologne air route, which had previously been offering a fairly high degree of service in terms of both number of seats offered as well as total passengers served. And then once the high-speed line opened in the early 2000s, that the air traffic really diminished quite substantially as the rail service increased. And then shortly after this, a few years after 2006, the air service dropped off to zero. And so this is a good example of a case where a short haul route, this is 136 kilometer distance between these two cities, which is roughly around 80 miles or so, clearly favors taking high-speed rail rather than the air transport. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric, who will share with us some of the findings from Paris and from Copenhagen.
Okay, thank you. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, next. All right. All right, as everyone can see here, unlike the Frankfurt where it's segmented and they're speeding up sections, here they built largely outwards from Paris. And it was 1981 they opened the first TGV East. That was 270 kilometers an hour. It's not really correct that it was the first in Europe. There was one that Italians will tell you that wasn't marketed and publicized as aggressively, but there was one that goes back to 77, and Italy would have made a great case study too. Okay, so if you look at this, you can see they don't go all the way out like to the Norman Peninsula or all the way to the borders, but they don't really need to. They go very fast, and then you go to relatively fast, 160 kilometer an hour. That's 100-mile-an-hour trains farther. So the catchment area without transfers can be quite large. And a particular note, you see Calais is where the channel crosses, and very closely related was the Eurostar, which was half owned by TGV, and the other half private venture. And I believe that now it has merged with Thales, which was another partially owned company. And so now this is a little out of date. It doesn't just go to Brussels, it goes to Amsterdam. And you can see actually there's an extension to Cologne. So don't think that this is all there is to it. It's a complicated network, and when you see a Lyon, it goes east into the Alps, and they're speeding up the trains in the Alps too. And there are actually Italian high-speed trains that come at a lower speed, and they actually compete with the TGV. Okay, next. Okay, now, it's not as impressive as the next city you'll see, but the same thing pertains that we saw before. The number of daily flights of shorter distances has indeed gone down. Now, the first CDG airport is called a TGV interconnection because it doesn't just connect to downtown. It allows trains to bypass Paris, and some do, and it serves places like Euro Disney directly. Okay, so if you look at this, you'll see that quite a few trips were taken away of the shorter distance, and not so much of the medium distance, but that's due to general traffic growth. That's a giant topic we could talk about forever. Okay, so, but the bottom line is the total number of trips pre-COVID is about the same, but when they say flights, there's a lot more long distance flights at CDG now than there used to be. So very relevant to O'Hare, we replaced a lot of these shorter trips with smaller planes with bigger trips, which by the way, bigger airplane trips, which by the way, I think the airlines prefer. There's a higher profit margin in those. So lesson to O'Hare. Okay, next. Okay, well, there's the Copenhagen, that's Kastrup Airport. There you see a X2000. They were built around 1999, hence the 2000. And they're still operating quite well. There's two national railways that come into the airport, the Swedish Railroad from the east and the Danish Railroad from the west and the south. And it's really a phenomenally good service. If you look at it, it isn't just Copenhagen. There's a major city of Sweden, Malmo, across the Öresund, the Sound. And when that line opened in 2000, you didn't have to pay anywhere near as much to take the train as you would have to pay a toll to drive your car. And it's also very well connected to Copenhagen, and as we'll see in a second, to other cities in Denmark. So it's an ideal place to have a high mode split. And in general, Copenhagen area is very rail transit oriented. So next slide. Okay, here's the thing that's really impressive. If you look just at the bottom off is the big city of Hamburg. That's the second biggest city in Germany after Berlin. And very much a transfer point for the railways. So if you see what's going on just at the bottom, the old way was to take the 200-kilometer-an-hour trains, the Deutsche Bahn and the Danish railway trains up through the peninsula and then across a bridge and across a second bridge onto the island of Zealand, where Copenhagen is, and the airport's at the eastern edge there. It's a long way out of the way, but the trains were fast. The alternative was to go to Puttgard, and some people, when I lived in Norway, they called it Puttgard, and like putt golf, because it was very slow. You come there and then you have to do a ferry crossing, and you have the old-fashioned rolling stock, and then you also had to go slow up to Ringstad. And so it was actually faster to go around to the west around that circle. But what has happened even before this high-speed line, which will now be complete in 2029, there was a dispute for 3 years on state aid, it's called. Basically, no industrial policy allowed. And Stena Line fought this and said this was an unfair subsidy to the railways and railroad companies. But it delayed it for 3 years. It'll be done in 2029. But the main point here is it's going to be very fast up to Ringstad, and then it will join the main railway into Malmo, and it will go north up to Copenhagen, which is was a huge traffic generator for business traffic, and it will go to Stockholm. But the speed has not been upgraded yet. There's still 200-kilometer-an-hour in Sweden and Denmark, but they fully plan on installing power upgrades to 250. It's not going to be that expensive because I think it's just a case of power stations that need to be given a little more oomph. It doesn't require more trackage. So it's all going to be timed for the completion of this. And if you look at this, one more important point here is that Copenhagen, as you can see, is between the two countries. It isn't just the Denmark business itself that it's pertaining. It's going to make a new, very convenient link to the continent, finally, without any slow ferries or without the circuitous trip. So what's going to happen to the airports, whether Copenhagen Airport's going to pick up business or Hamburg or all, who knows for sure. That's a modeling question. Okay, and then next slide. Okay, now you can see the number of trips is shorter. Denmark doesn't have very many big cities, and a couple 100,000 like Odense and Aarhus and Aalborg, and all of them similar to the plot that Andrew had shown, where the ridership dropped off, or the flight ridership. Okay, flying passengers dropped off. The same thing happened at Aarhus and Aalborg. Odense was always very close in to Kastrup. So, but those other two steadily lost, and there's only a few flights a day. Most of those airport passengers are for charters. There's a lot of charter business to south of Europe, to Spain or wherever, in Greece in the summer. Otherwise, it'd be almost to zero because, frankly, it's very convenient. The trains actually, like at Aarhus, have like 3 stops within the city: suburb, central city, and northern suburb. So it's really amazingly good. They don't have integrated fares, however, with the airlines. Okay, next. All right. Now, who wants to do the summary of results? Andrew, did you want me to do that, or would you like?
Go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we don't want to take too much time here, but I think Anthony covered this quite a bit already. But we can already see that there's a significant substitution effect. Well, there wouldn't be a big surprise about that if you make an attractive service. Okay, but total amount from the greenhouse gas perspective, the traffic's continued to increase, but it's longer distance flights and not the shorter distance flights. All right. And so you can argue that there's a big welfare increase and a prosperity increase, that more people can now afford to see the world. Okay, whereas a lot of the short trips on the highways, you can't say the same thing about it. All right, so the catchment area can be expanded and more passengers and employees can use the service. So one thing I didn't have time to mention about Paris is they're now going through an upgrade of their regional trains, and they're very much trying to create attractive possibilities for the employees of Charles de Gaulle, which is like 30,000, I think, was it 20,000? A lot of them. Orly's it's not a small airport either. They're trying to make it so that people can live near the airports. You have to take that into account also, in addition to the short trips. Okay, so next slide. And then this thing here on the right, this picture is the only one of something we did not study. We didn't include it, but I included this because of the question whether Europe is becoming more linked over time. And this is proof positive. Here you can see this is under construction, Rail Baltica. It's supposed to open in 2026. It starts at Tallinn in Estonia. You can take the ferry from Helsinki, and it goes through all of the Baltic states, and then it continues to Warsaw. And Chopin Airport is salivating over this because they see that they're going to get a lot of traffic from other airports, including maybe Helsinki. That remains to be seen. And there's a high-speed link being built from Berlin to Warsaw. And as you can see, that line shows on the left after Berlin, look at all the interconnections to all these major cities in Northern Europe. So this is the future. Okay, and now finally, if we went back to the original diagram showed at the beginning of France, you could see that Perpignan was separated from the bottoms of the TGV lines. Well, there are now at least 2 TGVs a day going into Spain, and there's going to be more later. The only question, there's a gauge change issue there, but they're still pretty impressive how fast they can change gauge on trains there, and apparently even with some of the higher speed rolling stock. And I already mentioned how Sweden and Germany are uniting because of Copenhagen. Okay, so that was pretty fast. I'm sorry if I went too fast. All right.
I'll just wrap up our presentation by saying that I think our study provides enough evidence to justify a sincere and serious look at what high-speed rail could do at Chicago O'Hare Airport. That requires a lot of data collection and some pretty serious forecasting, and it, we think, requires the participation of the main stakeholders at the airport, the city of Chicago, the 2 main global hub carriers that are there, American and United, maybe some other air carriers as well as the rail industry that deals with the infrastructure, the freight rail companies, Amtrak, and Metra, the operators of current passenger trains at the airport. There's a case that now is not too soon to be planning and taking some serious analysis of this so that when the high-speed intercity passenger rail network takes shape, O'Hare can be clearly and effectively connected to it rather than being an outlier and left out initially. So with that, we'll turn it over to questions.
Great. Thank you all for this presentation, especially since you are coming to us from Helsinki, the UK, and British Columbia. I don't think we've ever had such an international presentation before, so thank you. And we do have some questions, and I see there are more coming in, but let's get started on the ones that we have. Let's first of all, Eric asks, can the triple-digit speeds in Europe that might reduce or eliminate short-haul flights here be achieved in the United States?
Well, that's an incredibly good question. As I'm sure most of the observers on this webinar know, the pace at which high-speed rail is being developed in the United States has been relatively slow. However, there is some hope or optimism that we may be seeing this happen in a more incremental fashion, where we will see certain lines that will be upgraded to higher speed service. And I think, like in the case of Brightline in Florida, the response to that has been quite positive. And so if those kinds of successes can be built upon, we actually may see more successes going forward in terms of developing higher speed, which could then eventually get us to international high-speed standards.
I'll just add that there are a few little bits and pieces where triple-digit speeds exist in the United States. One of them is Rhode Island, where the Acela service on the Northeast Corridor for a short bit does, on good days, get up to triple-digit speeds. Rhode Island also has an airport with a train station directly connected to it at Providence, TF Green. Yet the Acela train doesn't stop there, even though that's the one place in the country where it actually does go at triple-digit speeds. So there's definitely some work to do in terms of planning and organization to try and put the pieces that we already have together, and plan to have a more integrated future as we incrementally get our trains back on track, hopefully.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Tony. Have you looked at the route that passenger trains would take while serving O'Hare Airport for both through trains and those ending at the airport?
No, actually, we have not done that. We were just considering what the implications of findings from other cases would mean for Chicago in general terms. In order to get a better reading on how it would work specifically in Chicago in terms of the actual routes would require further study, much more detailed analysis of the current network in Chicago and what would make the most sense in terms of providing that high-speed link to O'Hare.
Well, I do want to add one thing, though, Andrew, is that given how it's centrally located, there would have to be through lines. There might be some services terminating there, but I can't imagine a line wouldn't go east, not just east-west, but especially north-south up towards Milwaukee, right? I mean, it's not going to be a stub terminal.
Yes, I would say that the future research that is needed will probably work best if it's done through scenario analysis with different configurations of networks of future passenger rail connections throughout the Midwest and maybe even beyond, as well as those three different station tier configurations. I think it'll show quite clearly that the investment, which will be higher, for direct access into the airport directly connected the way Frankfurt or Paris or Copenhagen will generate the value in terms of mode use. But that's something that needs to be modeled out in future studies.
Okay, great, thank you all. Moving along, Arnold asks, has anyone looked at the current origin zip codes of airline ticketing patterns to and from O'Hare and Midway?
That's a really good question. Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
Well, I think the people who have are keeping that information proprietary. We did not find any public domain information on these matters. There isn't much research on rail and air relationships in the Midwest. And so what we can say is that it's time, probably overdue, to put public resources into doing that kind of open access research and collecting that kind of data.
Yeah, and I would just add that that is something that airports do typically collect. And so in a future study, I think that that would be something that would be good to take a look at with the cooperation of O'Hare Airport, to take a closer look at the zip codes of where the air passengers are coming from, and then how rail could actually help to serve some of those incoming passengers.
Okay. Thank you. Moving along, we have a couple of questions that might be for Rick, since these are about the High-Speed Rail Alliance and our activities. But here's the first one. Seth asks, has the High-Speed Rail Alliance looked into reaching out to universities on educating their leadership about the benefits of high-speed rail? And Seth says many out-of-state and international students fly into O'Hare Airport to get to school and then typically have to take a bus to get to their university.
That does sound like it's for me. I just want to say I was at an event some years ago in Lafayette, Indiana, where the civic leaders of Indiana were trying to convince the governor of Indiana that they should have a good train service. And the gymnasium was packed full. They had 5 to 10 speakers. And each one of them said, the future of Lafayette is tied to China. That means we need a train to O'Hare. And it was a very clear message. We need a train to O'Hare. And I hear that everywhere I go within 200 miles of Chicago. The challenge is the way our rail program in this country is structured. It's very hard to build those political supporters into an effort that can make it happen. But certainly universities are a key part in making it a reality.
Thanks, Rick. And for Seth, there's also, if you haven't seen it already, there's a comment in the chat about a group from the University of Wisconsin-Madison that's attending the talk today. Another question, probably for Rick, Frederick asks, and this has to do with the environmental dimensions of this that our speakers spoke about today. Frederick asks, has the Alliance thought about partnering with environmental groups and Amtrak to lobby the US government to ban short-haul commercial flights in the continental USA or under 100 or 200 miles, as has been happening in some other countries?
Certainly it's something that should be done, and we would love to see such a coalition. It would need to be tied with some real investment in getting trains running in this country, but certainly it's a coalition that should be built.
I'll just add to that, if I may. I think the late Hank Dittmar, who was involved in Reconnecting America and the Surface Transportation Policy Project, coined the term travel ports. He's the first person who used that. The idea being that you connect up the trains to the airports, and then all of a sudden it's no longer just an airport. And so over time, as we move to more environmentally sustainable transportation modes, the terminal and infrastructure facilities have they're future-proofed. In other words, most people in the Chicagoland metropolitan region know how to find O'Hare Airport. They feel safe going there and leaving their vehicle, which in the future might be an electric or other hybrid type of vehicle. And if there's a train they can take to get to where they're going from that travel port, they will keep going. They're more likely than going downtown to Union Station, where they can't find a place to park, and can use that infrastructure for more sustainable travel options in the future. So part of this exercise should also be about future-proofing the airport infrastructure so that we can have modal shift as and when we get serious about energy and climate change.
No, I have to say I agree totally with Anthony that you have to have a transition plan, and you're not going to transition all short short distance routes at once, but there's the low hanging fruit, and you need to have a path of how to do this. But I rings me not true when you hear people say, well, we have 100% elimination of like gasoline cars by 2040 or short distance flights by this date. There's diminishing returns. And so you have to do these analyses and see where the low hanging fruit is and where the big gains are. And then you go after the outliers later. But don't, in my opinion, don't overpromise at the beginning, right? You know, like show people some success. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And Anthony just referred to constrained parking around Chicago Union Station, and that may lead into answering this next question, which is essentially given the high capital costs of building to O'Hare in the way that that we're talking about, what would you think about the idea of running frequent metro style trains to and from Union Station to get to O'Hare?
Well, there currently is a metro service that does go to O'Hare, but it is very infrequent and not a very high level of service. Having a commuter line service that would operate at lower speeds would be helpful. However, the focus of what we were looking at and where the biggest impact would be in terms of higher speed service. And so that, I think, is really what we would suggest exploring more for in a subsequent study, would be to look at how Chicago O'Hare could be linked into an evolving high-speed service. And as we talked about before, that O'Hare Airport would be one of the nodes on a fuller network, so that it wouldn't be a stub end, but would be part of an integrated rail network. And so that's, I think, where the real value would come into play.
Okay.
Andy, we have a request. Can you unshare your screen?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Rick, did you want to show something, or you're just asking to unshare that?
Well,
you can see everybody better. Okay.
We've been distracted here. I do want to show, Anthony was talking about travel ports, and I think very few people know that this exists, but this is a fairly busy intercity bus station, and rental car facility and parking garage. And it has modest local transit, but should have a lot better bus service there as well. And this is where we are proposing on the back end of this, that the new train station be added to. But it's amazing the investment that went into this station. And it's located on airport property, and it's a quick people mover ride to the main terminals. So that ties into one of the questions from before. But it was a member of the audience saying that he wanted to see the speakers' faces that made the request.
Thanks. And we have just a few minutes left and a few questions. I think several of these kind of roll into each other, and they essentially add up to, where do we go from here? Barry says, as advocates, we have all the facts, figures, and data that shows that passenger rail makes sense for mobility, better mobility, but what's it going to take to get these projects started? And then Janelle asks a question, which is also echoed by one of our board members, Bill Porter. Is this information being presented to elected officials in Chicago and at the airport and the Illinois High-Speed Railway Commission? And then Tomas asks, or says, O'Hare is planning big renovations for Terminal 3. Can this be integrated into the planning for that? Where do we go from here in reaching out to all of these decision makers and stakeholders?
So I want to give you guys a chance to, if you have any thoughts, but clearly I have very.
Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Okay. So the biggest challenge that we have in all intercity passenger rail projects in this country is the fact that the way the law is set up, nobody's in charge. So if the program is all driven around states for long distance passenger rail service, and Wisconsin and Illinois are not going to cooperate very well to make a huge investment in Chicago to Milwaukee. It has to be a federal program. We've got a similar problem in more depth at O'Hare, where the Chicago Department of Aviation is responsible for all planning of facilities at the airport. They have no control over where the trains go. And then you've got the fact that Metro would really love to get into the airport, but they don't have control of the train station. And if we're going to go to downstate Illinois, that becomes a state issue. And if we want to go to other cities around O'Hare, that becomes a federal issue. So that's the reason we don't have good trains in this country, and we don't have trains to O'Hare. What can we do to get started? Mayor Johnson of Chicago can direct the Department of Aviation to start designing the train station and putting a stake in the ground and saying, we are going to build a train station that allows us to have a train in here every 5 minutes. And once you add up all the trains that need to go there, it's basically every 5 minutes. Governor Pritzker can direct IDOT to start planning a true statewide rail plan that assumes a train every 5 minutes between Union Station and the airport that goes on to Des Plaines and starts to disperse out from Des Plaines. And then we can start going after federal money to do those. But those two people, Governor Johnson and Governor Pritzker, are in the best position to get this started. And so there is a strong educational campaign that's needed in order to persuade them that that is in the best interest of the state. And I will add, I'm very excited as a resident of Illinois that Governor Pritzker is being incredibly aggressive about attracting high-tech firms to Illinois. And in part because of his efforts, we have a new battery factory going in just south of Metro service. We've got a really exciting research facility going in at Champaign-Urbana, etc. We need that kind of aggression on connecting those places with trains, because high tech requires collaboration in person, and trains make it easier to collaborate. So sorry to get on my soapbox after we were supposed to be talking about your research, but I really appreciate this. Are there any more questions that we need to ask before we go? Or
I think given that we're at the top of the hour, we should probably wrap up.
So thank you all who have joined us today. Really appreciate you being here. If you want to see more work like this done, please go to highspeedrail.us. That's highspeedrail.us, and hit the donate button. Working together, we can make stuff like this happen. And Andy, Anthony, and Eric, I really value the work you've done on this. This has really helped us understand better what the issues are, and we're looking forward to building upon this research as we move forward. And I hope that we can continue to work on this exciting issue in the future. So thank you very much for coming today.
Great. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Thank you all.
You again.
Hmm.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Take care.